which is the conclusion of these 3 chapters. Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise person who built their house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house. But it did not fall, because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish person who built their house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. One of my favorite books is a book by Howard Thurman, whose birthday was on Friday. He passed away perhaps 20 years ago. African-American scholar, teacher, for a long time a chaplain at Howard University, and the founder of perhaps the very first multiracial congregation in San Francisco in 1944. Howard Thurman was a mentor to Dr. King and many other of the great African-American leaders of the mid-century. And he wrote a phenomenal book called Jesus and Disinherited, which is a small book, perhaps 150 pages long. And he talks about how the teachings of Jesus were not for the people who were necessarily the most intelligent or the most educated or the wealthiest, but that the teachings of Jesus were for the people who live with their backs against the wall. And so he reinterprets the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount from the perspective of those who have their backs against the wall. And he interprets the Sermon on the Mount as a survival manual for getting through hard times. Reading from chapter 7 at the end, you see the legitimacy of this within the text itself, as Jesus links these 3 chapters together and sums them up. If you practice these things, Jesus says, you'll survive the storms that are about to come against you. It will be as if you had constructed your life with very deep foundations in something that was solid and immovable. And no matter what might come against you, no matter how strong the wind or fierce the gale or how high the waters might rise, you will survive because you have strong foundations. And those who don't put these words into practice, who just maybe are listening to them or letting them wash over them, or they're sentimentalized, but they're not really practiced, those people will be taken by surprise when the hard times come and when the winds blow and the waters rise. And their lives will come down, Jesus says, with a great crash. Now notice this is not a threat. Jesus is not saying, those people who built their houses on sand, I'm going to take them out. It's not a threat. It's an observation. It's an observation based in Jesus' own personal experience as a carpenter who had to build houses perhaps and had to determine where the best place was to build a house. And as any knowledgeable carpenter would know, a house is only as strong as its foundation. So then Jesus draws the parallel with our own lives, our individual lives and our lives in community together, and he says, let's build together on solid foundations. Because we can't depend upon life always going in the best direction. We can't always know that things are going to turn out the way we hope they'll turn out. We can't always know that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. We can't always know that all of our hopes and dreams are going to be fulfilled. In fact, if anything, the longer we live and the more we have experience, we know we're going to be taken by surprise. We're going to be disappointed. Our hearts are going to break, and they're going to break again. Therefore, we need to structure our lives as John Kabat-Zinn says, full catastrophe living. We want to be prepared for the full catastrophe. We want to build our lives with a solid foundation. We want to build, as Jesus says here, on the rock. I was in Tennessee this week at the Highlander Folk School, now called the Highlander Research and Education Center. Some of you might be familiar. Just curious, how many people are familiar with what the Highlander Center is? Okay, I'll give you a little tutorial. Highlander was a school, basically, that was started in the Appalachians back in the 1930s, in the very beginning of the Depression. It was started by a graduate from Union Theological Seminary, a student of Reinhold Niebuhr's by the name of Miles Horton. And Horton was focused on popular education among the workers in the mountains, basically working with poor, rural people, working with union people, working with farmers, in order to educate them about their lives and the systems that they were a part of, and helping them take more kinds of democratic participation in the construction and the development of their community and their region. Highlander continued to evolve and to change over the years, and it started in the Depression. In the 1950s, it became a center for the Civil Rights Movement, one of the places where blacks and whites would gather together in a common space and eat together and learn together and talk together. Rosa Parks was there, I think, just a week before she was arrested on the bus in Montgomery. Dr. King was there. It was a regular place of retreat for people from the stresses and strains of the movement, and it was also a place of formation, a place of strategy planning, a remarkable place. And it's still there, and it's still doing the same work that it's been doing for 80 years. And so I had been invited, along with lots of other people, back in October to come, and we were gathering for a post-election summit of what we call faith-rooted organizers, and we were going to talk about the election and how whoever was elected, that was going to shape how we think about organizing for justice and peacemaking in North America. Well, the election turned out somewhat differently than some of us anticipated, and the atmosphere in which we were gathering was a bit different than we might have thought it would be. And so we came with a sense of urgency, and many of us were coming with a lot of tension and nervousness. Granted, there was even some fear and anxiety, and some of us were still in a daze. Because it was less than a week after the election when we all came. So there were about 50 of us there. There were people from all parts of the country, from Los Angeles all the way up to Boston and New York. Whites and blacks and Latinos, male and female, old and young. And we came and we got together for 4 days and we told stories. We basically told stories about the work that we had been doing. We told about the amazing things that were happening and the amazing things that we were seeing people do, the courage with which people were stepping out. And we shared our anxieties and we shared our fears. And we were just honest about that. We shared about our concerns. And then we thought about, well, what can we do? We listened together about how can we respond. Do we just keep on doing what we're doing, but do it with more intensity? Are there new things that we need to do? Do we need to reevaluate our situation? We were just asking all of those questions, and I know without a single exception, all of us came away feeling incredibly more hopeful than when we had arrived. Not because the situation was any different, not because the challenges were lessened to any degree, not because our fears were even revealed as being unreasonable. I think many of our fears are quite reasonable. But we came away hopeful because we saw that God was at work in lots of different places among lots of different people, and that we were not alone. And we talked a lot about Germany in the 1930s, just because it had so much resonance with us. That feeling of kind of a crisis, of something being really different this week than 2 weeks ago. Of the possibility that the narrative that we've been living in might be going in a very, very different direction than we thought it would be. And remembering that struggle from 80 years ago, and how that impacted the church and how that impacted the entire world, and also remembering how the church really failed at that point in time. That the German church, the center of the Protestant Reformation, really failed in the face of the rise of National Socialism and the rise of Hitler as the Führer and the rise of that national spirit and that military spirit. The Protestant church in Germany capitulated and surrendered and gave in and didn't really take a stand to oppose all of that, as we, from the perspective of 80 years later, feel like they should have. But there were some at the time who felt differently and who saw what was going on and who felt like somehow as a Christian there was a need to sort of take a stand and to oppose these forces and gales of history that seemed to be moving forward. And one of those was a very young Lutheran pastor by the name of Did Bonhoeffer. And you may not be familiar with him, so we'll talk about him a little bit too. Bonhoeffer was not raised in a Christian home. He was raised in a very wealthy home. He was an aristocrat to some degree. But he had felt a call to ministry, and he had gone off to seminary and became a Lutheran pastor and got a PhD in theology and studied for a time in New York City at Union Theological Seminary, where he and Miles Horton actually were classmates. And in the archives at the Highlander Center, I discovered one day, was a transcript of an interview that they did with Miles Horton about his days at Union Seminary. And when he recalled this one day when he was standing out in front of the seminary gates with a friend on a Sunday afternoon, and they had just got back from church, and a taxi cab pulled up, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer got out. Bonhoeffer would have been 24, 25 years old at this point. And he was all excited because he had just come back from Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City, one of the largest, most progressive, justice-focused, spirit-filled black congregations in the New York metropolitan area. And he was all excited. And you weren't used to seeing this young German be excited about much of anything. And he was all excited because he told Miles Horton, "I finally found some real Christians in America," talking about these black Baptists. And while he was at Union, Bonhoeffer became friends with a French pacifist by the name of Jean Lasserre. And Lasserre had an enormous influence on Bonhoeffer's understanding of the gospel and what it meant to follow Jesus. And through this process, Bonhoeffer himself, even as a Lutheran, began to embrace the nonviolent teachings of Jesus. And then things started happening in Germany, and Bonhoeffer was in New York City, and Reinhold Niebuhr, his mentor, urged him to stay and not go back. And Bonhoeffer felt the call of God to return and do whatever he could do for his people. So in January of 1935, he wrote a letter to his brother. And this is a quote from the letter. He said, "The restoration of the church," and you can see why he's talking about the restoration of the church, because the established church was capitulating just almost completely to National Socialism. "The restoration of the church will surely come only from a new type of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old, but a complete lack of compromise in a life lived in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount in the discipleship of Christ. I think it is time to gather people together to do this." This letter that Bonhoeffer wrote to his brother came less than a year after the Barmen Declaration. The Barmen Declaration was a collection of Christians who were opposed to National Socialism and opposed to the capitulating Protestant church. And it was a declaration that we are loyal to Jesus alone. Christ is our only Führer. It came less than a year after that, and 4 months after Adolf Hitler had assumed complete dictatorial control of the German state. And it was 4 years before the beginning of the most devastating war in human history, which resulted in the deaths of 50 to 70 million people. Now, Bonhoeffer's proposal of a new type of monasticism at a time like that seems like a counsel of despair or withdrawal, perhaps even irresponsibility. What a time to think about monasticism when your nation is in crisis, when the entire world is in crisis, and you're proposing that somehow we do what? And yet Bonhoeffer clearly states that this revived monasticism will have nothing in common with the old. Well, what does that mean? How is it like monasticism and yet nothing in common, and therefore a completely new kind of monasticism? And some people have argued even that Bonhoeffer later gave up on this project. And if you know about his life story, he was involved in an assassination plot against Hitler, and he was arrested and he was hanged. I don't want to argue that today, although there's a Mennonite scholar, Mark Thiessen-Nason from Eastern Mennonite, who makes a very convincing case that Bonhoeffer never gave up on his nonviolent convictions. But I do want to ask a question for us today about what might lead someone as insightful and brave and devout as Dietrich Bonhoeffer to turn towards something like the Sermon on the Mount and the practice of communal discipleship as the appropriate initiative for engaged Christians in a time of national and global crisis. When things are falling apart all around, or when you're overwhelmed with fear and anxiety about what might be coming, why in the world would you go back to the Sermon on the Mount? Why in the world would you start thinking about a new type of monasticism? The traditional way that Anabaptists have interpreted the Sermon on the Mount, and obviously there are lots of pluralities in the Anabaptist tradition, but there's been an overwhelming consensus for the most part that the Sermon on the Mount is a discipline for a community that is somewhat withdrawn from the public square. It's a discipline for a community that perhaps doesn't vote, for a community that's not involved in politics, for a community that's focused on loving each other and caring for each other and serving each other. That the way we engage with the outside world is perhaps primarily through service, primarily through disaster relief, primarily through doing good works. But Bonhoeffer and Howard Thurman, and it looks like maybe Jesus at the end of chapter 7, sees the Sermon on the Mount as a key to survival in hard times. What did Bonhoeffer see in the sermon of Jesus for such a time as that, and what might we still see in the Sermon on the Mount for such a time as this? Bonhoeffer saw the Sermon on the Mount. He saw resources for responding to the German crisis in at least 3 ways. Very briefly. First, he saw that the Sermon on the Mount contained resources for resistance. The Sermon on the Mount contained resources for resistance to National Socialism and German patriotism and warfare. This resistance would be practiced not just in subversive anti-government actions, but also in the formation of a church. That the formation of a church would be an act of resistance against the insanity all around. And it would be a church that would not be seduced by false promises of blood and soil. Crucial to the practice of cultural resistance was the formation of a Christian people, a confessing church that would practice the Sermon on the Mount without compromise. Secondly, Bonhoeffer saw that the sermon and the founding of a new type of monasticism would lay the foundation for a new social order after the war was over. It didn't seem to matter to Bonhoeffer whether Germany won the war or not, although it's clear that Bonhoeffer, through his efforts, was working towards Germany's defeat, the defeat of his own nation. But what mattered was establishing ahead of time these centers for renewal, where a new type of recovery could begin and a new type of society could be established. So, not waiting for the worst to come and then beginning to work towards a new future, not waiting for the worst to get over with and then work towards a new future, but beginning to work towards a new future right now. Beginning right now through the instruction and direction of the Sermon on the Mount to form these communities that are already living out the kind of relationships and the kind of society that you hope would still be in existence after the time of troubles was over. Living an anticipatory community. In theology, we would call it an eschatological community. A community of resistance, a community of renewal. And Bonhoeffer saw that the sermon was the key resource for the restoration and renewal of the church itself, and the church's capacity to recover our voice as God's people. He saw an established church, he saw a Protestant church, he saw a Catholic church in Germany that had largely surrendered and capitulated and had refused to stand in resistance to the forces of darkness coming against it. And he asserted that the Sermon on the Mount would actually be the resource for the restoration of the church's true identity, for the renewal of the church and the church's ability to recover and to stand again as a center of integrity and witness and mission. The Barmen Declaration had unmasked the false religion of the established church. It seems like established churches often drift towards false religion, the worship of false gods, idolatry, misplaced hope. And there's this horrible, horrible cycle that we go through as peoples and as a nation of misplaced hope. We put our hope in the wrong things. We vote for those misplaced hopes. And when those misplaced hopes disappoint us, our despair descends even lower than it was before. And we go through another cycle of putting hope in the wrong things, and that hope disappoints us, and we descend again into despair, and it goes on and on. So there's a need within the world and within the nation and within society and within our own churches for someone to stand with well-placed hope. Someone to stand against idolatry. Someone to stand, as Jesus says at the end of chapter 7, with a foundation that's built on rock. That when the storms come and the winds blow and the waters rise, these people stand firm because their lives have been built not upon misplaced hope, but upon true hope in the work of the eternal God. A new church, a renewed church where Christians were catechized in the Sermon on the Mount wouldn't look like the mainline churches at all. And it would not be susceptible to all the seductions and false promises and false myths and phony patriotism that would come against it. It would be a church founded upon and shaped by Christ and the Holy Spirit. So, utilizing Bonhoeffer's example, what might we see in our own time of national crisis? And I do believe it's a crisis. There's a lot of conversation and there's a lot of debate, and there's certainly a tendency for us, just as a survival strategy, we all do this, to sort of normalize the abnormal. It's like the rude relative at the Thanksgiving dinner who says something inappropriate, and no one's comfortable with it, and no one really necessarily agrees with it, but in order to get through the meal, we just all kind of swallow our throats and just go on as if nothing happened. And there's a strong temptation for those of us who were dismayed and frightened by what transpired in the election to sort of just say, okay, well, that's the way it is. We have to respect the process. And the best way forward for us to survive as a people is to somehow normalize it, is to somehow begin to agree with it, to somehow feel that somehow this election is not any different than any other election. It's just that maybe the candidate we supported didn't win, and that just happens in America. but from the perspective of my African American sisters and brothers that I've been worshiping with for the last 5 years, from the perspective of my African American organizers that I just met with at Highlander, from the perspective of my Latino and Latina brothers and sisters under the threat of immigration, from the threat of the Islamic imam who was there from Los Angeles, there's something very abnormal about this time. There's something really, really different. And the survival strategy that we need to turn to is not one of normalizing the abnormal. It's the one of committing ourselves even more deeply and more passionately and more firmly than we did before to these things that we have been given. And especially as an Anabaptist people that has already enshrined the Sermon on the Mount at the core of our understanding of what Jesus was about, we have a special obligation as Anabaptists who already get what Bonhoeffer was just starting to understand. We have an obligation and a responsibility to the church and to the nation and to our communities and to each other to go even deeper than we've gone before. To no longer be content with just a superficial identity as a Mennonite or an Anabaptist, but to really start living these things out in a deeper and more intentional kind of way perhaps than we've done before. Our brothers and sisters need this. The love of God and the love of neighbor compels us to take what we talk about seriously, more seriously. We talked about all kinds of things at Highlander, from sanctuary cities to sanctuary communities and sanctuary campuses and sanctuary churches. Protecting those who are going to be vulnerable, those who are going to be threatened by whatever might happen, and it's hard to say. It's hard to say how much of what has been spoken about in speeches and policies will actually become true and really come into practice, but there's this wonderful quote by Maya Angelou which says, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time. So we've got to take it at face value. We've got to believe that what's been said and what's been shown is actually what we have to deal with until we see something to the contrary. And we know that those of us who are going to be shielded by our privilege and by our wealth are probably not personally going to feel as much as those who are marginalized and already struggling and already oppressed. So our choice as a congregation and as Christians is whether we will rest in our wealth and privilege, or whether, as the people of Jesus, we will extend ourselves and stand with and by and for and in front of and behind and around those who are going to be living with their backs against the wall. I don't want to be an alarmist. And I'm also not full of despair. Despair is not a weapon. It's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel disgusted. It's okay to feel afraid. That all has its place. I don't have a problem with people acting out in the streets for a while, for a long while, and just getting it out. It needs to be done. But in the long run, to speak in Star Wars terms, we're not going to destroy the Death Star through disgust and fear and anger. We're going to do it the same way the real church, the true church, has always shown a light in the darkness. Through radical faith, through radical hope, and through radical love. We will do this, my friends. The light will shine in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. This is the word of Bonhoeffer. This is the word of Howard Thurman. Even more so, this is the word of Jesus.